Segment 2, the danger. Paul Rahe, I quote you to yourself again. It is easy to see why political leaders should succumb to the progressive vision. You say it's easy to see why the political leaders, harder to see why citizens, but the political leaders first. Why would they succumb to the temptations of soft despotism?
John Locke once said, with regard to religious persecution, that there's a natural bias to our minds. And the natural bias is that we think we know better than other people. The better educated people are, the stronger that bias is in them. It gets inflated in character. So the tyrannical impulse, the desire to run other people's lives, for their benefit, of course, is there in all of us. It's especially visible in parents, and it's a good thing in parents. It keeps their children in line. It is much resented, and that's also a good thing. But it can be transferred into the larger world very easily. That's easy to explain. It's easy to explain the nanny state because there's a nanny inside every one of us. It is not so easy to understand why somebody would want to be under the nanny, except, according to Tocqueville, according to Rousseau before him, and Montesquieu, the dominant mood within liberal commercial societies where there is a modicum of actual equality is inquiétude. It's a word they borrowed from Pascal, and it refers to fear without a certain object. It refers to anxiety. It refers to a sense of not knowing what to do, of feeling just a little bit lost. In liberal societies, no one tells you what your religion is going to be. Eventually, I mean, your parents may, but they lose control at a certain point, and eventually the burden of deciding where you're going to come down falls upon you. In liberal societies, you do not inherit much property. Your parents send you to Dartmouth, and you gain skills. And making a life falls upon you. In liberal societies, the economy is generally prosperous, but it goes up and down.
Right.
And there will be times when bankruptcy may suddenly appear out of nowhere at a time when you thought you were very prosperous.
Hang on, let me see if I understand the underlying point, the underlying psychological point with an illustration. I've heard many friends say that this is shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russians would visit the United States, take in all the many wonders and do just fine, and then friends would take them, I've heard 2 or 3 stories that were roughly the same, then friends would take them to a grocery store, and there would be a kind of lock because of an incapacity simply to process the number of choices, the availability of choice, a kind of debilitating anxiety. One friend who was a Russian who got out early had brought his cousin, and the cousin stood in the produce aisle and broke down into tears. Just couldn't, and that's an extreme version of what you're talking about here. The anxiety of freedom.
In pre-modern societies, there's someone there to tell you what to do. There is the priest, there is the lord, there is some sort of capo, a boss of one sort or another. But the more commercial we become, the more liberal we become, the freer we are, the heavier the burden on individuals to fashion lives for themselves. And that naturally creates a species of anxiety. You can see it in college seniors. They have been on a line, and they have been sent to high school, then they've been sent on to college. And suddenly, in the fall of senior year, it begins to dawn on them that what happens after college is something that they are solely responsible for. And they're afraid. They're afraid because there's nobody to take care of them anymore.
Hence, they flock to grad school.
Yes, they go to graduate school, they go to law school, and they put it off. But nonetheless, it happens. So in such a society, because of the dominance of this mood of inquietude, there is a natural propensity for human beings to look for a helping hand.
All right. And so that template that you've just laid out, from Montesquieu to Tocqueville to Paul Rahe in his book Soft Despotism, fits beautifully, helps us to understand the psychological impulse of the New Deal. The Depression takes place. No one knows where to turn. There's that lovely, grandfatherly, charming soothing, calming figure in the White House, Franklin Roosevelt. Let him run the country. I get that. I even understand, I think, how your template applies to what happened here 18 months ago. Utter economic disarray, and Barack Obama pulls ahead in the polls. There's a moment when John McCain is pulling even with him. Then the crisis becomes undeniable, and Barack Obama begins to pull ahead. Many pundits said because he seemed the more reassuring of the two figures.
Sure.
Okay, here's what doesn't fit the template. The 1970s, gas lines, Jimmy Carter, but instead of producing a candidate in 1980, a president who took office in 1981 who was statist, it produced the reverse. You get Ronald Reagan. You get the reversion to an insistence on reverting to the old liberties.
And I think this
How come?
I think this will happen now once again, but let me come to that
yes,
later.
Please.
Let me start with your point. What happens in the 1970s follows the Great Society, which is the successor to the New Deal.
Right.
So you have
Johnson.
You have a massive expansion of the federal government just prior to this period of stagflation. Richard Nixon gets on board and completes it with the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration and affirmative action and on. And what happens is stagflation doesn't fit the template. Government appears to be incompetent. Government appears, in fact, to be the source of the trouble. Rational administration, the promise of rational administration is not kept because the administration is irrational. We have inflation at the same time that we have stagnation. We have interest rates that go as high as 14% on houses. I lived through that period, and I was an assistant professor on a very small salary, unable to buy anything. And it was terrifying for people.